I'm Melody Nichols. I publish under my initials, M.A. Nichols. I'm the moderator of this panel, so I'm mostly just here to ask questions and keep these people in line. I am an indie author, and I have 3 series out, both in fantasy and historical romance. We're just going to go down the row and have all the panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Stacy Whitman, and I am the publisher and editorial director of LTUE Books, which is an imprint of Lee & Low Books in New York. I started it as a small press, and they acquired it back in 2010, and I've been publishing there ever since. We publish middle grade and YA, all genres. We started out science fiction and fantasy, and now we do historical fiction, mystery, contemporary realism, nonfiction, all of the above.
My name is Johnston. I primarily write science fiction. Currently, I write the Ender's Game prequel novels with Orson Scott Card. Book 5 of that series is released this summer. I've also written for comic book series. I wrote a TV series called Extinct that no longer exists, and the joke writes itself, but I don't think it's funny. This isn't a series, but I'm the assistant managing editor of the Ensign magazine. So if you're interested in writing for the Ensign, talk to me afterward.
I'll talk to you afterward. I'm Emily R. King, author of the 100th Queen series. I write young adult fantasy. My next series comes out in June. The Evermore Chronicles, Book 1, Before the Broken Star.
Okay, jumping right in. As I was thinking about this, preparing for this panel, I got thinking about how there's basically 2 ways to go about a series. Either having each book in the series be kind of a standalone individual story that has maybe connecting elements, or having something that is each book is interconnected. For example, Lord of the Rings versus, say, the Dresden Files, which Dresden Files, you can pick up any book at any time, read it individually, versus Lord of the Rings, you jump into book 2, you're not going to know anything. What do you think, which is your favorite to write in, and what are the pros and cons to approaching a series with each of those styles? With either of those styles, I should say.
Well, the obvious advantage of writing a series, mysteries do this all the time, where there's just a recurring character, and each story is or a novel or episode or whatever is a self-contained story. The advantage of that is that it's a bottomless well, right? You can that series can go on for as long as, like the Spencer series, the Spencer for Hire series. That series can go on forever and a day. Or I really love Lee Child. I love the Jack Reacher series, and those are, each novel is a new adventure. I can pick up any novel in the series and know that I can't be lost. But when we wrote Extinct, that wasn't the case. Extinct is a serialized drama, and the downside of that, particularly in television, is if someone doesn't come in until episode 4, they're a little lost, right? They're okay, what's going on? Who are these people? It's not a self-contained episode. And so there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of having an ongoing series is that you leave the reader somewhat unsatisfied intentionally, because they feel obligated. Oh, what happens to this character? How does this story end? I have to buy the next novel. So, and that's why in publishing very often, at least particularly in speculative fiction and science fiction and fantasy, the publisher likes to package a series and they do a trilogy. So all of my contracts, well, that's not true. Most of my contracts have been trilogies, because the publisher knows that, okay, once I establish an audience for book 1, they will feel obligated to buy book 2, and that there's an existing fan base, and they can rely on sales, which is what publishing is all about.
I think it's really interesting to look at how it's done differently in children's books. Particularly, middle grade is a little bit different series than YA. YA, because there's such a large adult audience for YA at this point, I think the last numbers I saw was that 60 or 75%, I don't remember the exact number, of those who buy YA books for themselves to read are adults, which to me as a YA publisher is a little bit of a problem. because I'm thinking about like what are teenagers actually reading. But as far as like sales numbers goes, that means that it's reaching a wider audience. So it's changing a little bit in YA compared to what I'm about to tell you. In that in children's books, series have to be fairly limited because your target audience is going to age out of your series. And that depends on what exactly you're talking about as far as series go. When you're talking about something like the Magic Treehouse, that's kind of an infinite series, because once kids start to really like get hooked on reading, they want to absorb as much as they can of that same series. And that's chapter book series. They have to have a certain amount of shelf space to even be noticed as something that will sell in a bookstore. So kids do eventually age out of that, but they don't necessarily read all of them. They kind of pick and choose whatever is available, available on the shelf at the time, whether at the library or the bookstore. When you get to something like middle grade, the Harry Potter series is a really fascinating study in how series changed in children's literature from prior to that. There were series like the Nancy Drew, Trixie Belle, and Hardy Boys kinds of series that were also kind of in the Magic Treehouse vein, but Harry Potter was a limited series where the first 4 books were very much about that age, and she wanted the kids to grow up with Harry. I don't know how successful she was because the books were paced out a little bit more than a year apart, but I think she did a fairly good job. But mostly series in middle grade are going to be a little bit different than the series that you see in YA, and generally series in YA tend to be, unless you're talking about somebody like Throne of Glass, what's her? Sarah J. Maas. So unless you're talking about a really best-selling series like that, you're going to see a trilogy and that's it, because your target audience will have then aged out and have moved on to other books.
I'd say as a creator, you look at it a little bit differently. You would know going into book 1, if you have enough material for more than one story to turn it into a series. Then you need to make the decision if you are going to be changing who the main character is in the story, because that would change whether or not, and you can add other characters in and have dual POVs, but if you're ever going to let go of your initial main character, and if that's what you would like to do, quite often you will see the companion novels. I think the one that comes most to mind is Graceling and Fire in Bitterblue by Kristen Cashore. She worked within the same universe and kept some of her characters, but who was the main character changed in that. And that's probably my favorite way to see companion novels. So you should probably know right before you start book 1, if you are intending to turn it into a series, if you're going to keep that main character throughout, or if you'd like to switch it, because that will make a difference in how it's written or how you're going to pitch it to sell it.
And I think that's a really interesting thing as well, because it also depends on how you're being published.
Right.
I think that Kristen Cashore and some of Holly Black's books, but not all, are a great example. I often, because of the way that I publish books, when we're thinking about the school and library market, I'm looking for standalone with series potential, because sometimes we don't acquire book 2. And if somebody pitches me a 7-book series, I can't commit to that because that's just the way that my publisher works. So it also depends on who you're selling it to, where they're selling the books in their market as well.
Okay, when dealing with a series that is very interconnected, the serialized story, as you referred to it, how do you know when to end each novel? Because in reality, it's really one big story. So how do you chop that up and know where to end each book?
Oh man, that's a hard question, because it's not an easy decision. Well, generally in our series, in the Ender's Game prequel series, each book is building to something, some big event, some clash that our heroes have to overcome. But it's sometimes difficult. It's sometimes difficult to know have I finished the book in the right spot? My editor has told me, I think we can end now, right? But I was like, you're right, but there's one more chapter, and then she very graciously agrees, yes, we needed that chapter. So that's hard, you know. I personally, I think the two most difficult decisions when writing a novel, be it a part of a series or not, is when to begin and when to end. You know, like one of my favorite books as a kid was Last of the Breed by Louis L'Amour. I really read a lot of action books when I was a kid simply because that's what my dad read. And I would sneak into his bookshelf and grab his books. And in that story, it's the story of this, most of you may not have heard of Louis L'Amour because you're too young. But in that book, it's about this Navy pilot who crashes, this is during the Cold War, he crashes in Russia, and then he's imprisoned. And then the novel is about his escape and survival in Siberia as the Russians are hunting him down. And he's this Native American, and so he lives off the land, and it's very Jack London-y. But what's interesting about the story is it begins after he's captured, after he's been in this prison camp, and I don't know if I would have been smart enough to begin the novel there. I think I might have made the mistake of beginning it, oh, he's in training and he's learning how to fly this jet, and then I would have done the whole crash sequence and everything, when in fact, it began precisely where it needed to begin, because that's where the action takes off, and that's where the reader is really hooked. So that's a long-winded way of saying your question is super hard, because it's really, really hard, for me at least, to know when to begin and when to end.
And I do apologize for the hard questions, but I like throwing them out there every once in a while.
This is all right. Okay, yeah. I used to work at Wizards of the Coast, and everything we did was giant series. Like, I worked on Dragonlance: The New Adventures, and I already had, I don't know how many books, but 30 years worth of published books in the adult series that I had to reference to work on the Dragonlance: The New Adventures series, which by the time I ended, I want to say we had 25 books in that series alone. And what we did was we started breaking it down by trilogy, interconnecting the characters and all that kind of stuff. And as I was working on this, and I was working on other series like the Hallamere series, which was only 7 books, Piddly, yeah. And these, like I was talking about, these are more in the vein of, you know, like the Nancy Drew kind of serials, as opposed to, you know, literary kinds of series. But I was watching Buffy at the same time as I was editing these books, and I really came to this epiphany at that moment of the structure of Buffy is really what I really wanted my authors to be doing. Because if you look at the full 7 season arc of just the TV show, I'm not counting the comics and all that kind of stuff, but the 7 series arc has a full arc. There is one giant story. But then you can break it down to season 1 has a story, a beginning, middle, and end. Season 2 has a beginning, middle, and end. And every single episode has a beginning, middle, and end. And then you might even have little individual, like maybe 3 episode arcs of beginning, middle, and end. And each of those, we have a large arc and then smaller arcs, really helps us to set up, and we could begin, we only have one place that it begins, and you can't really come in the middle. I tried to come in the middle of Buffy in college, and it was so confusing. I didn't really pick it up until much later because it was so confusing to try and watch it live on TV in the middle of like season 3. But my point being that you can end it at any time. Like say you get laid off and all of your books are canceled, as I was. All of those books just kind of ended. Yes, there were still some open-ended questions at the end of each of those books, but each arc had been closed. each of the little arcs had been closed, even if the larger arcs hadn't necessarily been closed. And so I think that looking at how your arcs are shaped, the structure of your arcs really does make a difference in knowing where and when to open and close, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would add with the arc thing, characters. What does your character want at the beginning of book 1? And I think your character should get a little bit of what they want and beat a little, a bad guy, maybe not the main, but have some sort of accomplishment by the end of each installment, no matter how many there are. And if your character hasn't gotten what they first wanted, then you're not done yet. There will be more books, more installments. The series should end when they ultimately get the thing that they really have been after. And not the minor things, not the little things, but the really desire of their heart, the really big thing that they want, that is your ending. If you give that to your reader and then you say, here's another book, they probably won't come back because they got their book. They got the ending. They want a sense of accomplishment for your character. They want to see growth. They want to see them overcome obstacles. But the number one thing that they want, the thing that really drives them, should be in the last book. Harry Potter had beat Voldemort at the end of book 1. Kind of did, but really didn't. You wouldn't have come back for 6 more books. You stayed for 6 books because you wanted to see that. And you watched the growth for him to get to the point where he was really ready to take him on. So think of it that way. If you don't know if you're done yet, does your character have what they want?
I would second that. For a series, there is a macro objective, right? The characters in a series have a big uber macro objective. In each book in the series, there is a micro objective. Even though we're talking about a novel, which is, if it's an epic fantasy, it can be 200,000 words. There is a micro objective in that novel, because when you begin a novel or a story or a television series or whatever, you make a promise to the reader, and when that promise is fulfilled, then the story is done, and then the book is done. And yet you have to, if you want this to be an ongoing series, you have to dangle a little something. When we wrote Extinct, we knew that at the end of the season we had to fulfill our micro objective for season 1, but we had to leave the macro objective for our heroes completely unresolved, so that people had an appetite they were hungry for season 2, because there were unanswered questions. There was this dangling cliffhanger reveal. What is this? It's not going to be resolved until, because we are in the culture of binge watching, binge consuming, and so we've programmed ourselves in our stories to tell a beginning, middle, and end, and then just a little bit more, so that you have to come back and discover the conclusion.
And I would add, though, that you probably, as far as the big arc go, helped the viewers to really feel like they'd moved forward in knowing a little bit more about that big arc, but they just hadn't been resolved yet in knowing it, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that I think infuriated fans of Lost, right?
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
that
Never answered
there was all these things that were invented that we just gobbled up because, ooh, that's cool. What does that mean? And sadly, the writers were like, yeah, we don't know what it means because we don't have an answer. And then they didn't resolve a lot of those things.
Right.
And when you leave readers and viewers unsatisfied, they will never forgive you.
Question about what we just.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay, so when you guys are talking about the macro level thing that goes over an entire series, do you have to be able to show such that the reader knows what that big macro thing is in the start? Like in Hunger Games, we didn't know Katniss was going to start a revolution back in book 1. Does that make sense?
You can go ahead.
So I would say that the macro objective for Katniss Everdeen was she lives in this awful, terrible, dystopian, oppressive society that is cruel to her mother, that is cruel to her sister, that left her father to die and unforgotten in tragedy. That is a broken world. That broken world is the macro objective. Fixing that broken world, whether she realizes it or not, that's what we as viewership are that's the promise. Mm-hmm. This is unfair. This is unjust. This must be resolved.
Did you have anything to add?
Just
of
that,
itself. Yeah.
just that the starting a revolution. Oh, sorry. Just that starting a revolution then is part of the reveal of the objective, not the objective itself.
Yeah.
So the reader knew it, but not the character.
Yeah, because you were unsettled by it. This isn't fair. This has to be undone.
Just keep turning it on. Okay. Question in the back?
Yes. So for a series that build on top of each other, like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, where you can come in, but it's usually a little bit more confusing, and you know a lot more if you start at the beginning. I've noticed, like, to take those two examples, Harry Potter was a year of school, and the same kind of things happened. I mean, yeah, there were different new things that came in, but for the most part, he went through a school year. He went up against a big bad. He somehow survives. He went on to the next year and through this nasty summer, and then it starts all over again. Whereas,
And yet you bought the next book.
Is there a question in there somewhere?
Yes, there is. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, you're building on it. I mean, the same thing doesn't happen per book. Which would you say is a better formula?
I would say that Harry Potter is built on it too. Everything that he's learning and the relationships he's gaining with his friends and learning more about the outside world and the real forces that he's up against and how the bad guys really multiply with every book. I would argue that even though some of the setting format is the same, that was required to build the outside conflict.
He's leveling up. He's leveling up.
Yeah.
I would also add probably the biggest challenge for me I've discovered in writing a series is that you have to assume that new readers are going to come to the series at different points and different times. So one of the biggest challenges of writing a series is educating the reader who did not read book one, giving enough exposition to the reader in book two that you don't lose the readers of book one, right? They don't become impatient. Yeah, I know all that, right? So I think one of the biggest compliments you can get as a writer of a series is, hey, you know what? I came to your series in book 3 and I was with you. I wasn't confused, and yet at the same time, those readers who have been with you, they're not complaining about being reminded of everything. Mm-hmm. So, and that's really, really hard to do. That's in my list of really, really hard things to do, which is a really long list. Conveying exposition in book 2 or in book 3 that delicately conveys the story that we've missed to the reader without boring or testing the patience of those who have been with you from the beginning. That's really, really hard to do.
Yeah. I would say choosing that scene that you start that next book with is very important, maybe even more important than the first scene in the first book. What you choose to show in that scene can educate the reader into what has happened, and depending on the gap, like if you have a month gap between book 1 and book 2, it catches them up on that as well. So you have to put a lot of thought into where you want to bring your reader back into your world in subsequent installments.
One more example that in thinking about a micro and macro objectives is, I think, Game of Thrones. I'm talking about the novels, not the TV series. When the novels begin, we meet these characters whose names I don't remember because it's superfluous. All that's introduced in that first scene is, oh, there are White Walkers in the world. There are these weird, dead, zombie, frozen people that will kill you. And then, if I'm not mistaken, we never see them again for the rest of the book, right? Because this is the macro objective, right? There is something wrong in the world that, for whatever reason, everybody else in this universe is completely oblivious to. But we, as a reader, know, something is amiss here. There's some sort of magic. There's ghouls. There's zombies. There's something in the world that's disruptive. And yet we don't get to that until much later in the series. Really, book 1 begins. Not even with the beheading. Book 1 begins when they find the dire wolves, and all the wolves are assigned to the children of the Starks.
And I just have to say, you guys keep jumping over questions. I keep it's funny. I was like, yeah, let's talk about the exposition and everything. You guys just cover everything. It's awesome. What about cliffhangers? Of course, that is very popular with series. How do you do cliffhanger right, and how do you do it wrong? Are there good ways to use them? Are there bad ways? Do you like using them? What are your thoughts?
Go ahead.
I think cliffhangers can be great if you know that the next book is coming out, for a fact. Because sometimes books can get canceled, and then your readers will be eternally mad at you. We still have girls emailing Tiffany Trent in the Hallamere series, which was canceled in 2008, saying, "What happened?" And sorry, she's basically come to the point where she's like, I can send you the manuscript, but Wizards won't let me publish it. So as long as you know that the next book is definitely coming out, hey, great. Leave people on a cliffhanger that has at least satisfied the reader a little bit.
So from the perspective of television, an hour-long drama series is generally follows a 5-act structure, right? And there is a 5-act structure in television simply because at each act break is a commercial break, right? Because networks, they don't make shows to entertain us. They make shows to sell advertising, to make money, right? And so as a result, whenever an act ends in a television episode, you are competing with Doritos. I don't mean the ad Doritos, I mean physical Doritos, because someone may say, I'm hungry, and then they leave and they don't come back to your show unless you've given them a reason. So when we wrote Extinct, there has to be a mini cliffhanger at the end of every single act in an episode. And then there has to be a big cliffhanger at the end of each episode, or they're not going to come back for episode 2. So to answer your question, do I believe in cliffhangers? They are absolutely necessary for television, whether we want to admit it or not. We expect them as an audience, and they're required to maintain the attention of the reader, or excuse me, of the viewer, because you're battling with advertising.
And this is the entire reason that I stayed up entirely too late in grad school watching 24.
Right?
Like, my roommate and I actually had to make a decision that we would watch the middle of the episode to the middle of the episode, because we could not ever end an episode and just turn it off. We had to know what happened next.
How many of you who said to your spouse or significant other, whoever you're watching the
Just
show
another
with,
one.
let's just watch one more episode? Yeah.
And then Netflix will come on and say, "Are you still watching?" And you feel
Yes, of
totally
course.
judged. Yes, I am still watching. I've seen it done different ways, and it's interesting because I've actually read books. I don't know if you guys read Kelly Armstrong at all, but she's notorious. She writes paranormal for just ending in the middle of a scene. That's it. And maybe because I had the other books, I wasn't as irritated, so I just went to the library and got the next book. But I think it takes a lot of experience in craft to be able to do that. I would recommend it. I read a book recently that starts with a character escaping a terrible situation and ends with the love interest tricking her and her ending up right back in that situation. And I've been reading the reviews for it because I had a feeling that readers were not going to be very happy that the entire point of the book was for her to get away from this enslaved position, and at the end of the book she's right back where she started. Readers want to see some sort of progress in it, and if you feel like you've made that progress, then a cliffhanger is probably more acceptable than if there was no progress made.
I'd also add that television is very different from novels. Usually if you read a novel when it's released, you have at the very least a year before the next novel is going to come out. And so if you reveal some ridiculous cliffhanger at the end of your novel that a reader suddenly has a lot of anxiety about, and they recognize that they won't know the answer for a year, they will be pissed off. So for our series, for Ender's Game, we have a cliffhanger in the sense that we get a taste of something to come, but it's not like a soap opera cliffhanger, like, I'm really your brother, and it's like, what? So it's not a cliffhanger that's so shocking to the reader that it's like, where did that come from, right? All I need to know is, okay, Harry is still alive, Katniss is still alive, or whatever, right? And yet the world is not resolved. The issue is not resolved. Our hero overcame this massive, life-threatening obstacle, but the world is still broken. And that, in and of itself, is a cliffhanger. It's different in novels than it is for television.
Yeah.
Okay, with a, say, trilogy style, where it's all interconnected, Lord of the Rings kind of thing, a lot of authors do struggle, especially beginning out, struggle with saggy middles. And with a trilogy, book 2 is really the middle of your story. How do you avoid having a saggy book 2?
I give my character something they really, really wanted at the end of book 2. That's normally what I do, because it gives a sense of satisfaction. The main problem hasn't been done, but usually I have them face their worst fear and overcome it and get something really great for it and prepare to gear up for the war book. When you think of, I love to use Star Wars as an example. When you think of The Empire Strikes Back, everything that could go wrong went wrong. And that's why it was so dang good. And at the end, there's just a moment of hope between Luke and Leia. Just a little bit of hope right there. And it was enough to bring you back to know that they're not done. They're not down and out. They're going to come back and get it. And that they needed that moment. It saved the entire film, my perspective. So think about that moment. What's going to be that thing that's going to save everything, the train wreck you just watched, and or read, so that people will come back and read what happened next?
I'd say a couple things. One, treat every book you're writing as if it's your last, meaning if you have a bunch of great ideas, don't put them in your great idea bank and say, I'm going to save this for book 6. No, you put it in the book you're writing, because by the time you get to the next book, you're going to have some more great ideas that you hadn't considered yet. So all those wonderful ideas, don't store them up and keep them from the reader. Use them. Fill your book with wonderful, great ideas, wonderful world-building ideas. I'd also suggest introduce, at least I did this, introduce new characters that prove pivotal in your series. In our Ender's Game prequel series in book 2, I introduce a character called Bengwen, this Chinese boy who we did not even know existed when we started the series, but who has become integral in the series and who really transformed the subsequent books in the series. We did this on Extinct as well. When I wrote episode 2 of Extinct, and this goes back to my third point, which is be willing to abandon your outline, right? Don't feel beholden to your outline. You are not a slave to your outline. You created it, you can throw it away. So when I wrote episode 2 of Extinct, I created this character called Duncan. And initially when I created the episode, I needed a skin writer, a bad guy, to be fleeing from the other bad guys. And I thought, this is kind of a superfluous throwaway character. Wouldn't it be interesting if he was actually intimately involved with one of our heroes? And that's what we did for the series. And when we brought him onto the show, he completely transformed the 10-episode outline that we had written and that we had sold to the studio, and it took the show in a completely different direction. If you watch the show, you know that character becomes critical to the show, right? So point number 3, to avoid a sagging second book or a sagging second episode or whatever, is be willing to change when new ideas come, because in the creation, in the writing process, you'll have new exciting ideas that come that are birthed from that process that you get, that you don't want to throw. Well, no, I can't do that because I've got this outline that I've got to stick to. You are doing yourselves and your readers a great disservice.
I think also in book 2 you have to be willing to recognize what your stakes were in book 1 and outdo them in book 2. Always be raising the stakes. If they figure out at the end of book 1 that the world really isn't as they thought it was, and they've had this big reveal, you've now raised the stakes, and they're going to need to be up against a whole lot more in book 2, and that keeps the reader engaged, but it also it's a leveling up situation. Your character should be facing deeper challenges and greater challenges, whether you're talking about the emotional arc or the external arc. Their emotional arc should be taking them to new emotional places, and their external arc should be taking them to new action places, like plot places. Does that make sense? Geography specifically, or
Politics.
all of the above. Yeah.
Anything, yeah.
Question, so my question was about outlines. So if you have this big arc for your series, and then you find that you need to veer off that outline, how do you fix it? How do you make it consistent where it's still a satisfying arc, even if it wasn't what you had planned?
Well, if you've published book 1, you can't change. It's now canon, right? So that you can't go back and throw away. Just kidding, I'm going to do it over again. Though there was an author to do that. I don't know if I mentioned this, but one of my favorite books was First Blood by David Morrell, which is written back in the late 70s. It's the story of John Rambo, okay? And Rambo, we say that and we all kind of roll our eyes. Rambo, stupid. But the book, First Blood by David Morrell, is brilliant, okay? At the end of First Blood, I'm going to spoil this for you, John Rambo is killed. He's killed at the end of the book. And then the book became massively successful. David Morrell's career as an author took off. The movie was massively successful. And then David Morrell came back for book 2. Just kidding, he's really alive. Right? So, which everyone was like, okay, I guess I'll go along with this. So my point is, if you establish something in the first book, or any book that's already been published, that you can't change. Or in my case, we're writing prequel novels to Ender's Game, and what happened in Ender's Game is canon. Those are things we can't change. So we can't rewrite history. But if you're moving forward, it's not history. You have the ability to change that and alter that as new ideas come to you. I don't know if that answers your question, but only what's published is canon.
So how do you make a match, I guess? Like, if you start out with this fear, but then in the end, would it be a satisfying ending? Does that make sense? Like when we talk about characters, how their arc will veer off, how do you make sure it's still satisfying if you have to change your direction?
Well, I think the question is it satisfying to you as an author, right? You're like, oh, I had this really cool outline, but what I have now is better, is more satisfying. If it's going to be more satisfying to you, chances are it's going to be more satisfying to your readers, even though they won't have anything to compare it to.
Sorry, in the black behind you, sorry.
I've noticed in a lot of television series, a character will have huge growth one season, and then the next season they smack him down to keep him in the same place. And I think it's because they're trying to get the same actors and different things. Is there a way, when you're doing a series, how do you let the character grow and keep those things that the people fell in love with the characters, like their flaws and things? Does that make sense?
I think Supernatural is a really great.
Sorry, we keep getting feedback, so yeah.
I think Supernatural is a really wonderful example of a series that allows characters to really, really grow over the course of 14 years, or is it 15 now? I don't even know. Anyway, the characters continue to grow. The world continues to grow. I actually got really bored when the Angels were introduced, but it was a moment of growth for the story where the world was opened up even further, and then I got back into it, blah, 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 and talked to Lisa Mangum. She's the expert on all things supernatural locally. But I think it's a wonderful example of a TV show or of any kind of storytelling that keeps going deeper and keeps raising the stakes and keeps allowing their characters to grow, but keeps the heart of what really is the heart of Supernatural is the relationship between the brothers, and that is always going to remain the same. I mean, not exactly the same. Their relationship continues to grow, but the way that they love each other as brothers continues to be the same.
Just to answer your question, also, I get a little prickly, I guess, when someone asks, well, what's the character arc? What's the arc? How does the character grow? I think that sets a false expectation on the writer, because the character doesn't always grow. Sometimes the character just endures. Sometimes the character just survives, right? You know, Dr. House on House, he's a miserable scoundrel in season 2. In season 3, he has some new qualities, I guess, in subsequent season, but he's a scoundrel, right? And that Sherlock Holmes is Sherlock Holmes, right? Jack Reacher is Jack Reacher. He's not suddenly a saint, right? He's like, oh, I'm a new person. Harry Potter is Harry Potter. He always had those heroic characteristics inside him. They're just birthed through the experience. So I always get a little uneasy when people say, well, how does your character transform? Well, he doesn't transform. He just makes it out alive, and sometimes that's good enough.
Okay, question back there? Yes.
So some authors debut with a standalone and some authors debut with a series. Is one better than the other?
Whichever the publisher is willing to pay you money for. But seriously, though, a publisher most debut novels are financial failures, and publishers know that. They know that because you're not a brand yet. You're not known to people, right? Stephen King is a brand. Stephen King could publish the phone book and people would buy it, right? But if you publish the phone book, there's something wrong with you, right? So it really depends on what the publisher, if a publisher says, hey, we're going to pay you such and such to publish your standalone novel, or we're really interested in this as a series, your answer is, okay, I'll take your money.
And speaking from the publisher perspective, what makes the publisher decide, okay, we're okay with doing this as a series, has a lot to do with, one, their publishing model. At Wizards of the Coast, when we did do books, I don't think they even publish books anymore. Their entire model was very long series. The model in most trade houses that are selling into bookstores is going to be trilogies. Some are a little bit longer, especially when you're talking about epic fantasy. And in children's books, it's going to be trilogies or even standalone. A lot of children's book editors and YA editors are saying standalone with series potential of the kind that we were talking about earlier, where you might be playing in the same world but with different characters. And all depends on where the publisher is selling the book, what kind of expectations that bookseller has. Because, for example, look at the state of Barnes & Noble. It is going the way of Borders. If Barnes & Noble goes away, where are your epic fantasies going to be sold? Well, there is a little bit of a resurgence of independent bookstores that we're seeing a little bit of a renaissance. So let's see where that goes. But publishers are paying attention to the business end of things, and we're always making adjustments. For example, we're in the middle of a paper crisis right now. And a lot of writers aren't thinking about how many pages, literal pages, are my books going to be printed on. But we, as your publisher, are. And in children's books, for example, I'm starting to think, 400 pages is a little bit expensive. Let's cut that back. So we might not be always thinking about publishing epic series right now because we're thinking about economics as much as the story.
Go ahead.
And I would say as a story, if you're querying your first book, right, and you are hoping it's a series, but so when an agent talks to you about it, getting an agent, they're going to ask you, do you have more of the story? You should probably sound like you know what you're talking about and have thought out something, because there's a good chance that when they go to submit that, they're going to want at least, a blurb, at least, probably synopsises for like the rest of the books. But I wouldn't go on to write the second book. I would leave that and start something new. And then if the publisher comes back and says, hey, we want all of them, that's so great, you take the money. But I would always go into it trying to sell the standalone, always, until you're established, but that's a whole different thing. But if you're just getting started, one book at a time.
Also, I keep in mind, since most debut novels are financial failures, particularly in speculative fiction.
That hurts when you say that.
Yeah, it's true though. If a publisher is investing in your debut novel, really they're investing in you. Mm-hmm. They're saying, oh, you're interesting, your writing style is interesting. They're hoping that you'll become a brand. They're hoping that you'll be able to feed them. So if they're buying your standalone novel, they're more than buying your standalone novel. They're investing in you.
I'm afraid we're out of time. So if we could just go down really quick, give just where you can find us next. I know it's the end of the conference, but I know some of us are still busy. But
I'm going home to work on a manuscript. That's where you can find me. You can find me on Twitter.
The next panel I'm in is in at 5, the ins and outs of collaborating with other authors.
This is also my last panel. Find my publisher at TUE Books, TUBOOKS, and I'm Stacy L. Whitman on Twitter.
thank you.